Hello, I'd like to welcome everybody to General Government. Well, I guess it's Vision Committee today. We have with us just a handful of city council members, but there'll be more coming. And I would just like to officially start the meeting and ask for a roll call.
Councilmember Dennehy?
Here.
Councilmember Gonzalez? Absent. Councilmember Jaquez?
Here.
Councilmember Meisner? Absent. Councilmember Reed? Absent. Councilmember B. Smith? Absent. Mayor Pro Tem Hamrick? Absent. Mayor Smith?
Here. And I'd also like to point out that on the dais, city council members and neither Ryan Stevens or Cindy are wearing their face masks. And that's pursuant to the allowance that if you're being actively broadcast, that we don't need the face mask for that process. But if you are sitting in the audience or in the galley, please do keep your face mask on until you come and present to council. And then at that time, you can remove your mask. At this time, I'll turn it over to, should I turn it to Catherine?
Yeah, this is the appeals ordinance, and it's going to be a report from the city attorney.
All right, thank you, Catherine.
Good evening, Mayor. So I'm going to share my screen here so we can talk about the appeals ordinance you have in front of you. Hopefully you have in your packet the draft ordinance, a memo from us, and a draft resolution for Planning Commission. So I'm just going to dive right in. The ordinance does a couple of things. It makes pretty significant changes to the two sections you see on your screen. And then it clarifies a lot of building code and licensing issues and who should hear appeals on that. And then finally kind of makes some modifications to the process to make it easier on the applicant to actually, or the appellant to actually appeal the decision to the appropriate body. So chapter 2.52 that you have in front of you, it's only got the two sections, 010 and 012, is your main appellate section. So throughout the code, there's appeals sprinkled throughout, going to various individuals and bodies, and including city council. But these two provisions have some issues in them. And we're going to start actually with 020. You'll see that, hopefully you can see what I've highlighted there in blue. So this provision basically says any other appeals process is trumped by the provisions in this chapter. So the first issue we have is that this negates all the other appeals processes found elsewhere in the code, including all the building codes that are adopted by reference. So that's issue number one. Issue number two in this section is that it conflicts basically with the appellate authority in 010, which says that only certain things should go to city council. So appeals that are made to the Board of Adjustment, or appeal from the actions of the Board of Adjustment itself, don't go to city council. So if you were to ask me which one applied, I would have trouble giving you legal advice as to how to handle an appeal under those two conflicting provisions. In addition, 020 talks about personnel matters. And it has a conflict within that second sentence itself. First, it says the procedures in this chapter are not applicable to personnel regulations in this for personnel regulations of the city, except for grievances, but then goes on to say basically like once the grievance procedure has been, that process is, the employee has gone through that process, they can appeal the employment decision to the city or to the courts. So it's to put it lightly, it's very confusing as to whether or not this section applies to personnel matters or not. But beyond that, consistent with the advice we've given you in the past, it is our recommendation that council, with the exception of certain employees like Ryan basically stay out of personnel matters for a number of reasons. One, it's not really within the scope of your authority, even though you designate it to yourself in this chapter. It can bring, as a result, it can bring liability upon the city, council members personally. And to be frank, I think personnel matters are often highly emotionally charged events. When someone is being fired or disciplined, that's usually when an appeal or grievance arises. And dealing with that from a city council perspective, you would have to address that in a public forum. You could not address that in an executive session. So you couldn't hear an appeal in executive session and make a decision because you're not permitted to make decisions in executive session. So that hearing would be in a public forum. So even though personnel matters are generally private, and obviously the employee would be waiving it by making the appeal, it makes a very private, emotionally charged event public. And so it's always our recommendation that council step out of those decisions and that the appellate process end basically with the city administrator. I do want to point out that there is another section of the code that deals with personnel matters and basically council's appellate authority, and this would be changed in the ordinance as well. And this is even basically broader than just going through a grievance process. This is essentially any decision made by the city administrator regarding an employee's status with the city. So it's hiring, promoting, demoting, firing, suspending, anything like that could potentially be reviewed by city council. And so, you know, for the reasons I've already mentioned, we recommend addressing that and changing that. And you're going to be reviewing a new personnel manual here coming up, and that appeals process is structured to go no further than the city administrator. So that's that big chunk. And what we did was, in the ordinance, is we basically rewrote that section to talk about appeals to city council, because there are maybe a couple instances where that might occur in the code. Addressing appeals to boards of adjustments and directing that to the code section that is currently there and deals with that. And then appeals to the city administrator, because as you'll note, we are directing some appeals from city council to the city administrator. And so this kind of just lays out really briefly what needs to be supplied by the applicant and the process. So that's the main changes for those sections. The remainder of the ordinance basically addresses, as I mentioned kind of in my opening, that it's addressing licensing and building codes. Your building codes were kind of all over the place as to who was the appellate body. And so we have made it the Board of Adjustment throughout instead of City Council. It was a mix of a Board of Appeals, which you don't have, and City Council. So we provided you with this chart that lays out what sections of the code are being changed in the section of the ordinance, the corresponding section of the ordinance. Only the ones highlighted in yellow are being changed, but this is every single appeals process in the code right now. So building codes, as I mentioned, are going to go to the Board of Adjustment. At least that's what we're proposing. There was a mix between the Board of Appeals and City Council. There's one change in the subdivision regulations that if you give us a go-ahead, we're going to take to Planning Commission to change that to the Board of Adjustment as well. And that's pretty common that land use decisions would go to the Board of Adjustment for appeals. And that's currently what most of your code, except for this one section, has in it. Lastly, we changed a little bit, as I mentioned earlier, the procedures. We deleted, there was a lot of very complicated, very kind of almost court-like procedures that were required of an appellant. And I don't think that's necessary. Lay people can rarely feel the need or desire or want to comply with really complicated procedures. And frankly, there's no real need for that. I don't think at a city level to have those complicated procedures. So we took those out and basically just said they can appeal the decision in writing, and made it very, very simple and gave a deadline for that appeal. So it's not overly complicated for them to do it, because they do have a right to appeal, and we don't want to make that a huge hurdle for people if they have a legitimate reason to appeal and a legitimate reason to see a decision overturned. So that's kind of the summation of what we're proposing. I'm happy to take any questions. I know I kind of breezed through that rather quickly, so I'm happy to answer any questions.
Are there any questions from council?
I don't have any at this time.
I have a couple of questions, Catherine. With this new process, what is the step-by-step kind of flow chart of if a staff member wants to appeal a decision?
Oh, for like a personnel matter?
Yeah.
I'd have to pull up I don't have the personnel manual in front of me that's being drafted right now, but it's going to depend on what level that person is at. So, a department head is not going to have an appeals process, because the decision on a department head will be made by Ryan. But lower down, if a department head makes a decision about someone who works under them, then I believe they will have an appeal to Ryan. But let me check really quickly before I.
I guess my next question, maybe while Catherine's looking, Ryan, you might know, is what is the role does HR have in any of this? Is there a role?
Yeah, HR plays, a facilitation role, and there's typically a lot of coaching and discussion before a decision like that's made with the department heads. So HR plays a pretty heavy role in a lot of those decision-making processes.
What do you mean by coaching?
Working with the department heads, making sure that they're handling the situation appropriately and in line with best practices.
How often does our HR need to perform those services?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't know offhand how to quantify that.
How often are those services taken with a complimentary finish?
I think, usually they're, we don't have a whole lot of appeals that come through that process. We're making sure that we're taking the appropriate steps throughout the entire process.
Catherine, another question I have is that sometimes there are kind of long-standing personnel matters that can be political or community-driven, and sometimes council does feel a need to be a voice about some staff issues to be taken seriously and addressed. Are you saying that's not appropriate for council to give advisement or insistence or direction?
I think that it's appropriate for council to advise Ryan of an issue that they see and an issue they want addressed. However, there's a difference between doing that and maybe having an executive session regarding a personnel issue within the city and having a public forum hearing on an issue. Personnel matters are private. They are not meant for public input. That's just a recipe for disaster. I've experienced it. I've had public personnel appeal hearings, and it's awful. It's awful for everyone involved. And there's a big question as to whether or not the public gets to be involved in it, and this just eliminates all of that. So to the extent council has a role, it's to talk to Ryan about issues that they see, and maybe voice what they would like to see potentially, depending on what the circumstances are, but it is not something to be openly discussed in public.
And
It's fraught with liability.
And what is your recommendation if a decision's made that council doesn't support?
Well, it depends, I guess, on who's making that decision. But if, let's say, Ryan makes a decision, then you need to take that up with Ryan and whether or not you agree with his job performance in making that decision that you don't agree with. But that does not change the fact that you don't agree with it doesn't change my concerns about the legality of council being involved and the liability that's associated with it.
I got a question.
Councilman Jaquez.
Yeah, Catherine, I'm looking at the very first page with the yellow markings that you have. On the very first one dealing with hiring, promoting, demoting, all that other stuff. Now, if I'm reading it right, does it say that we as city council are no longer involved in that portion?
That's correct.
Okay,
Our proposal is that is repealed in its entirety.
And the only reason I bring this up is because we're going to be in the process of basically hiring a new chief of police. So now, city council will have basically no say-so other than what we feel is the right person, but that doesn't mean what we feel is the right person. If the administrator wants to hire somebody else, he can do it. Is that correct?
Well, so I'm not familiar with what you're doing with the potential new police chief, but I will say that technically the chief answers to Ryan, I believe, under your code. So yeah, he has the hiring decision-making authority. That's not a
Okay.
direct report to
So
council. That's
in other
my
words, we
recommendation.
as a council basically would just make our recommendations as to who we feel of the candidates would be the best one suited for the position, and it would still be up to the administrator to pick the person that he chooses to pick.
That's correct.
Okay, thank you.
Ryan, would you like to give just maybe a brief overview of how the police chief hiring process is going? I mean, this is kind of pertinent to the subject.
Sure. We've received 30 applications that have come in through our recruiting company, KRW, and actually have a meeting with KRW on Monday to talk about those 30 applicants and their qualifications and do a first cut at those candidates that meet the qualifications versus preferred qualifications and should be making it to the next round. We'll be working on the next phase of that recruitment, which includes some group interviews with stakeholders that are going to interact on a regular basis with this position. There may be a meet and greet as well, where we had talked about that with KRW very early on in the process, but we left that kind of up in the air depending on what the COVID requirements and restrictions are as we got into this. That recruitment stage, we're seeing that probably middle to end of September when we're actually getting to that interview phase of the recruitment process.
And what part will city council play in the hiring?
Yeah, I had a call with Corey about that today. Very similar to what Catherine was saying. Making sure that we've got an appropriate process involved there. And again, I think that probably something along the lines of a meet and greet, and having some of those first impressions and recommendations through discussion. Similar to what Councilman Jaquez had mentioned earlier.
Any other questions or comments?
My button's not on?
Oh, my thing's not plugged in.
Hello. Okay. In regards to 2.0430,
Yes?
how does that particular section relate to what I think still exists with the unique council approval for the city clerk position? Or has that been changed already? Is that not the case, is that council must approve the appointment of the city clerk?
Yeah, so the office of the city clerk is appointed and removable by the city administrator subject to the consent of city council. So the repeal of that section, the 2.04030 would not, the ordinance does not change that section on the city clerk.
So how is that particular section relative to, let's just say that that's a director position, how is that any different than, let's say, the other directors?
Well, you have a specific code provision that has that in there. Now, I think that that consent should be removed personally. I think all directors, if you want the clerk reportable to city council, that's fine. Then they should be reportable to city council directly. But I'm not a fan of that section particularly, but you do have a specific provision. Now, there's a whole section on the city administrator that gives the city administrator the authority to appoint and remove all employees of the city and to supervise all the heads and directors. And so, I think that you've got a problem there because you have one provision that says he's supposed to do all these things, and then you have this provision basically that says no matter what he does, they can still go to council. And I think that's a huge liability. The city clerk you've got a special provision which you could change if you'd like, or you could keep as is.
But that's not the way the section on the clerk reads, is it? Are
Yeah,
you
I was
reading
reading
that?
it out verbatim. Yeah, it says there shall be an office of the city clerk, the head of which shall be the city clerk, appointed and removable by the city administrator, subject to the consent of
Right.
council.
It's still appointed by the administrator, but subject to review.
Subject to consent, which means
Right, consent.
not review. Review is after consent is approval beforehand.
So to clarify, but that particular section is not going to get repealed with
It's not
2.0.
included in the ordinance unless you want it to be.
So I'll go back and say I'm confused as to why the clerk, which I view as a director, is any different than any other director. In terms of the consent that Mr. Hawkes is referring to, that I understand the legality, or at least the position of our attorneys relative to to employees, but it just seems that I guess I would prefer to have some ratification on directors. And I realize that's a change from what we're talking about and slightly off course, but it is relevant to 2.0430. And I guess we need more council input on that particular subject.
What kind of revisions are you requesting?
Well, I'm just saying that I guess relative to directors, I personally would like to see the same verbiage for all the other directors as there is for the clerk.
Can I clarify one thing with you, Jim?
Sure.
Is that more of an appointment issue for you, or is it more of a removal, or is it both?
Appointment. Yeah, I think the removal thing, I think it's an appointment issue.
Okay. So we can propose language that would provide a ratification, I think that word's a good word, by council of any, and I guess I need some clarification, maybe I can get it from Ryan later, about who's a director, who's a department head, are those terms used interchangeably, or so just so I can figure out who's subject to the ratification and who's not.
I think our directors are readily identifiable in most of the city documents, are they not?
Yeah, I think, to Catherine's point, directors and department heads typically used interchangeably.
That's what I would say too.
And again, that's my personal preference. I don't know where the rest of council would sit on that issue of ratification of an appointment.
I
Any other
guess on
comments?
an appointment, I can see it, I guess ultimately, when we're talking about these things, we hired Ryan to do the job, and this is part of his job. And I guess when we see with the head of each division, I guess ultimately it all falls back on Ryan. And I mean, we can say that we want, Ryan might want to hire somebody, and we at council say no, and then we got that conflict. And it's, I think ultimately, because the bottom line is, whoever gets hired, whenever, at any point, the bottom line is, Ryan's ultimately the one that's behind that person. And I don't know if we hired Ryan to be the city administrator, and I think that comes under him. And if things go amok, which I highly doubt they would, but then we have that recourse. But I don't know if we need to be the ones into the hiring phase when we hired a city administrator.
Council, yeah, but this is a question to Ryan. Is there a separation between, and this goes back to what Jim's talking about, directors and department heads? Do we have two separate titles for each one of those positions? Is there a separate title for a director and a separate title for department head?
Those are interchangeable titles. I refer to them as department heads. I believe the code may refer to them as directors.
So I don't know if this solves some of the confusion. Let's just get rid of the verbiage director and make everybody that qualifies as a department head, that's a department head. And disregard director's position, that maybe that'll help solve some of the confusion that we're looking at here. I can't see the difference, in my opinion, between a director and a department head. So maybe we can just bundle everything into one category and put it that way.
Well, I guess that's probably something that's going to defer back to Councilman Meisner and how he feels about that. I don't know, 6 to 1, half dozen to another in this particular circumstance, I think.
Well, I'd be more comfortable with just one title. This way it makes it a lot simpler, I think, and I don't know about the rest of the council, a lot simpler to deal with that way, and then also your position as the administrator for hiring and firing.
Okay.
I have two things. One, I think maybe some of us who've been on city council longer have concerns, with experiences in the past of city administrators that were not hiring well. Whereas right now, right now I have trust with Ryan, but that doesn't mean he's going to be with us for the rest of eternity. Someday, there might be an administrator that we want to make sure that their goals are in alignment with the council's goals in the type of people they hire. So that's one of my concerns. But on the flip side, I'm not sure how many directors or department heads would want to try and accept a job with confidence if they know they have to go before council for approval and ratification. That might harm the recruitment process.
And that would be my question as well, is what process or procedure would we go through for that, and then also adding time to the recruitment process as well. We try to move people through before they accept a job somewhere else. We want to make sure that we're moving efficiently and effectively through a hiring process.
And we can always make
I'm gonna bring this
changes.
back up here again.
Yeah.
To me, a lot of this other stuff, I don't have a problem with it. But based on what's going on right now, that's why I feel it's very important to stress, and maybe continue this part to another time, to stress on the other council members, this is a very important meeting to be into. This way, if we have everybody here, or even the majority here, then we have some knowledge of which way we're gonna go. Right now, you just got 3, and that's not even a majority. And so, I think we have to at least have a majority of those council members. This is important, as far as the whole thing is, but this phase of it is really, really, I would think, at the top of the list of importance. And I would just look at maybe we can put this off to another time, stress on the other council members. You need to be here for this one here.
Yeah.
And then whether or not there's a possibility of binding director and department heads when we have our next meeting. That's my feeling.
Yeah, and Councilman Jaquez, just for the record, this is the second time that we have brought this back before council. Similar conversation the last time on the importance and having a majority of council here to discuss.
What's the process for making this change? It would be an ordinance? Resolution?
Resolution for planning commission, correct, Catherine, and ordinance for council?
Well, yeah, for the proposed changes that you have in your packet tonight, it's a resolution/ordinance. But the change that you're talking about, the ratification part, would be by ordinance as well. And one thing I want to, I guess, put out there, because I'm not as aware of all the decisions that have been made regarding department heads and hiring. You've hired some recent department heads, and I don't know if you applied the same process that you want to apply to the police chief. So I think, and maybe you do, or maybe you did, I just wasn't aware of it. But I think you need to think about whether you've even treated department heads the same way in the past, or whether it's like more, I hate to say more prominent ones, but maybe like someone like the police chief, you do want to ratify, but maybe the HR director or finance director, you weren't involved in that decision. And maybe you weren't, like I said, I'm not aware, but we can group them all together. That's perfectly fine, but I just want you to be cognizant it will be all of them if we do that.
You said it would be, but we could split it?
Of course, you could split it.
But I think there is a level that we need to, I mean, if we can't trust our administrator to hire appropriately, then that's not the administrator for us. I don't think I want to get too micromanaged. Part of Ryan's success story is us being able to empower him to create a board and a cabinet that he can work with and have a team that he can manage to accomplish our goals. And if,
Well,
I don't want to hamper that.
okay, let me tell you this. I go home tonight and get a call from a citizen, and they're asking, what are the parameters for hiring the new police chief? And my response is, I have no clue, because I have no clue about what that process is going to be, other than the fact that we've hired an independent person or company to take care of that. And I don't know that that's appropriate in terms of, particularly with the chief. I think the chief is somewhat of a unique position, but for council to respond to the public that we have no control, no influence, no input, which is what I'm interpreting, on the hiring of a chief, I think is ludicrous. And that's what I'm understanding is going to happen, because you're using an independent company, and you're going to come back and tell us how the process is going to be.
Well, I don't think that's 100, it's probably 95% true.
98.
But no, I'm giving you 95. But when we look at what you're talking about, you know, we don't have any control on that. To some extent, there's that 5%, I guess. When evaluation comes around, there's where we do have,
Right.
in a sense, with regards to that. I wish it was more simple than what than what is happening right now, because it is an important position. But we do still have something in there. The only thing is, the way it's set up now, I don't need, to change it right now, it'll be 2023 before we get a new chief of police. And we need one right away.
And I see what Jim's saying, because we do have to answer to our constituents. There's no doubt about that. And that does make it tough. And then that, ultimately, if we get a bad police chief or anything, ultimately, and I see what you're saying, if somebody wants to run for council again.
They're gonna call him.
No, they're gonna call us. I agree with you 100% on that. I see exactly where that's coming from. And, boy, I mean, ooh. Yeah, I do. I see exactly where that's coming from.
I'm good.
That's when you just say, Ryan, you better hire somebody dang good, because otherwise, whoo. And I'm joking with you, because I have full confidence, you know that.
So how do you want to move forward? Do you want to move forward with it as is?
Huh?
Do you want to move forward with this as is? Do you want to make a recommendation?
We need to move forward with the whole process. That doesn't mean I'm gonna support it.
Would you feel more comfortable if we ratified the city clerk and the police chief positions?
I don't know.
Because, I mean, I can see city clerk because we work intimately with the city clerk as a council. I mean, she's really keeps us flowing and operating, and we have that direct relationship with her that we don't have with other department heads. But police chief is another one that has a lot of accountability.
I think even the ratification process is after the fact. So, I'm crying over spilt milk, probably.
But can I ask a question of the other two council members? And when we're looking at bringing this back, would it be a little, add some simplicity to this? Because when we bring it back, if we bring it back with, let's eliminate directors and just categorize everything into department heads. It still will create some situations down the roadway, but at least now we're only going to be dealing with, in a sense, one title, department heads and not directors. And then the other council members can lay in on how they feel about that, because this is only going to be our recommendation, and we're trying to make a recommendation for 4 other people. Then I think that would make the situation a lot simpler if we did something like that.
Yeah, we can take a look at the language and try and streamline it and simplify it.
Which language?
The department head versus directors.
I just seem to recall 5, 6 years ago that we being the administrator, changed the terminology for department heads to directors. I mean, would that not be documented somewhere in our HR department?
There's some homework for you.
6 years ago, I don't know.
Well, I think the code switches between the two terms. So we have a code issue and we have a personnel manual issue. And they may not be in sync, one, because the code uses both. I mean, I'm looking at the provision right now and it uses both, heads or directors. So, I mean, we can take a look through the code and we can make sure that whatever we choose for the code is the word that's going to be in the personnel manual.
To me, it doesn't matter, other than, I'm like with Frank, you call them department heads or directors. Whatever you're gonna call them, but
Yep.
we need to get away from this. Because even in this document, they're referred to as department heads, which was created by a department head
Okay, so
or a director.
I'm getting a census that we'll simplify some of the language for Ryan to take that direction of looking back and either designate department heads or directors for consistency of title. But we'll bring this to the all of City Council. Well, I guess it goes to Planning Commission first, is that right? Or to City Council?
No, the ordinance just comes to city
Yeah,
council.
to city council.
Yeah.
So let's bring it to city council and we'll go from there. I mean, we've had it here twice, and I think generally the sense was to move forward as is, so.
Actually, Mayor, I'm sorry, I missed out. The ordinance is gonna have to go to planning commission. It's got one minor planning zoning change to it, so.
Okay. All right, are we ready to move on then?
Well, while we're on this subject of personnel, I mean, what's the chances of council getting some kind of a overview of what this process is going to be to hire the chief? Or is that not legal?
Were you here when Ryan went over that?
No.
No, oh yeah.
When?
Just right before you came, I asked him to go over the process.
Well, yeah, but you didn't give us any more information than he gave us the other night.
Yeah, I can write
I mean,
some
what's your criteria for determine, is that not a legitimate question?
criteria for,
For
Yeah.
what would be the ideal candidate?
yeah, well, we've got we've got our job description, and the criteria is, 15 plus years of experience, bachelor's degree, preferred to have a master's degree. We're looking for the FBI and additional training academy certificates. We are also looking at the organization size that they have a history in as well. So making sure that there's a good fit from that standpoint compared to Canyon City. We want to make sure that they're familiar in operating in an organization of this size and similar type of budget. We've got a lot of criteria that we're working on, and I'd be happy to do an additional write-up for you.
What about being able to adhere or be proactive as far as some of the newer issues coming up with equality, reporting, and use of excessive force, things like that, to be able to have that flexibility to move forward
Yeah,
in
yeah.
policy changes?
Yep, there's certainly, new policing trends and things like that we're keeping an eye on as well, and have several candidates that have experience with that.
And I would also like to see, the support for a co-responder program and making sure that's executed well as code enforcement, and working with the district attorney's office to have the foresight to keep people out of the prisons who need to be directed to the services that they need to actually take care of the problem that got them arrested in the first place, such as drug addiction or mental health issues.
Those are things that you're going to have to implement on his review.
I'm just letting them know up front right now, since we're on the subject. That would be on my criteria list. Okay, are we ready to move on then?
Yeah, I'm really excited about this next one, too.
All right, Jim's ready. So I'd like to invite our auditors to come forward, please. Well,
Thanks, Catherine.
yes, thank you very much, Catherine.
She's gone.
She's still there.
Again, invite Tammy Nordyke up and our auditors.
Where's everybody at? This is what's weird. I mean, why isn't the HR person here?
Tammy, would you like to introduce our guest today?
Yes. So with us this evening, we have Jim Hinkle
Good evening.
and we have Chris Parker.
Hello, everybody.
Chris Parker basically was our lead auditor for 2019. And then Jim Hinkle is the managing partner, the owner of the firm?
Yes.
So what we're going to do is we're going to go over a presentation first that Finance has prepared, and then we'll turn it over to the auditors so they can let you know what their process was and answer be open to some questions. So what we've prepared is just a brief presentation that shows some of the major funds. We were looking at general fund, and we wanted to show where we came in on our revenues versus what was budgeted for 2019. And as you can see by the bottom line, that we actually came in $365,000 higher in revenue than we had initially budgeted. The main areas of that were our licenses and permits, and then also in some intergovernmental revenues. And you do see that we have areas that did come in under budget as well.
What's in the other category?
Our other category is basically, so when we sell our properties, if we have scrap metal, that random type of revenue that we don't necessarily, we budget thinking, okay, we're going to have some scrap coming in, or we're going to have fees from possibly NSF checks, those type of things. It's just smaller categories of revenue that are, that we don't necessarily rely on as heavily as our taxes and the other larger categories. When you look at the expense side, we also did come in $3.7 million below budget. The biggest area that we had was in capital, and that was in the other, which meant that it was not related to streets. It could have been parks, it could have been engineering, because if you recall, in 2019, we had budgeted to have the wayfinding signs completed, and they were started actually in 2020 versus 2019, but we had anticipated that happening last year, and so that was one of the large projects that would have been in the other category. This graph shows that basically a visual representation of where our largest revenue source comes from. As you can see, we had 59% of our revenue coming in from sales and use tax, which we do know that is our biggest category. We also have our intergovernmental revenues coming in next, and then the Royal Gorge Bridge.
Can you click back a couple just quickly for just a second? There. And then forward one? Okay, thanks. I'm good.
Okay. You just want to see if I could manipulate the clicker, right? And then this shows where we spend our money, just, so it's easier to look at and see. So as you can see, that public safety had 32% of the budget, and then followed by general government, and then our capital outlay. And that is all for general fund. This graph just shows the history of our sales tax, and it is only the general fund portion of it. And as you can see, that we are continuing to have increases in our sales tax.
I have a quick question. So I saw that it said that our general fund revenues were around 12.5 million, but we spent over 14 million. So where's the gap?
The difference comes from our fund balance, our reserves. our policy has, we can use our reserves for capital items and those type of things. And so when we've also sold, let's say previously we'd sold property and it had went into, basically that kind of rolls into this, where our fund balance says, okay, we can use this money for various projects. When we have our assigned, when we've sold property, all that money goes into the assigned fund balance, and then we can only use that to buy other properties. So in our budget, if we had property that we were going to purchase, that would come out of our assigned fund balance. Our unassigned fund balance we can use for any project as long as we are maintaining the level of reserves that council has put in place.
Is that the 10% non-spendable? Because I thought we had to put away
No.
more than that.
That's, the non-spendable is, what's that? Our Tabor reserve requires 3%, but non-spendable, if you look at, hold on 1 second. Our non-spendable includes items such, that are not easily converted to cash and such. I'm trying to find, hold on.
35 of the whole document, or page 5 of the financial statements.
Thank
Regular
you.
Page 5.
It's just a good thing to have them here so they can throw us real quick there. So it will show you on, as Jim had said, on page 5, what is in our non-spendable, which includes our inventory, prepaid items, and then also our interfund receivable. And then the restricted includes our Tabor reserve. That is our 3%, and it is slightly above that. Our committed does, show that part of it is for culture and recreation, and then general government, and then we also do have various under the assigned.
So for that 2 million difference that capital projects were spent, was that, I'm assuming wayfinding signs was one of them.
The wayfinding signs were not actually completed in 19
Oh,
or started
right.
in 19, but yes, there were some capital items in 19 that would have been funded out of our fund balance.
So, can you click backwards? Go back to that page. Well, you don't need to go to a page, I don't think.
So again, what were the capital items that had the $2 million difference?
To get the specific ones, I will need to come back to council with that. I do not recall right off top of my head which they were. We do have in our management discussion and analysis the list of capital items that were purchased. And that does show that we had purchased copiers, the 5 copier printers. We had purchased a video system upgrade. In here, we had done the HVAC system for the police annex building, a boiler for police annex, or for the police station, library circulation desk. We purchased the vacant lot on First Street. We purchased the parking lot and clock tower. We purchased also 304 South First, repaved parking lots in Centennial Park, installed curb and gutter at Centennial Park.
Okay. Yeah, so we bought the clock tower in 2019.
Yes, that was in 19.
Must have been the end of the year.
Time
It was
flies.
close to the end of the year. Yeah, it was, I think, either late third quarter or beginning of fourth quarter when that happened. And then we'd also purchased Constantino's last year.
It seems to me what's misleading is when you look at revenues and expenses without I don't know how to say this, but without the monies from the fund balances, those numbers look good, but then when you, as Ashley has said, and we've seen in some other reports, and I'm not sure what report it was, we spent 2 million more than what we took in. Is that not correct?
That is correct. That we had current revenues of 12.5 million, and we had expenses of 14.3 million. That is correct.
Is that fundamentally healthy?
The large items are typically our capital that we're funding out of the reserves. And with our policy that we have in place, we do maintain between 20 and 30% in reserves in our unassigned reserves.
Well, so I know for the big things like Skyline and Constantino's, we'd been saving and holding on to that for a really long time to do some important, big projects, including the wayfinding signs. But what about the little things like trucks and
And
vehicles?
trucks we're
That
buying
should
aren't
be,
right.
yeah, but they should be coming out of, is that something we're also saving up money towards, and that's coming out of our allocation fund?
No, those are budgeted items.
We budget the capital items every year, but if our current revenues will not support them, we can use the unassigned fund balance to go towards those capital items. And Councilmember Meisner is correct in saying that, if you're always relying on your reserves to fund even the smaller capital items, that it is not necessarily the best way to go.
But the movement of the money, of funds from the fund balances, you move that over to general fund?
Each fund has their own.
But if you move money from unassigned to general, who
So-
decides that?
So what this is that this is how the fund balance in general fund is categorized.
Okay.
And so
All right.
we legally look at it and say, okay, what goes into spendable, what goes in, the non-spendable, what is restricted, what has commitments, where there was, there'd been action from council before stating that the sale of properties goes to assigned, and we can only use that to purchase for additional properties.
But when you move money from one fund to the other fund,
From one category to another? On the,
okay, category,
okay.
from one category to the other category, who authorizes that?
It has been authorized by previous council by stating what items go into assigned. When we've said that the land sale proceeds go into being able to purchase additional properties, then that goes into part of the assigned. The others are based on our accounting principles, where if at the end of the year we have retainage or those type of things that are going to be spent in the next year because it's an ongoing project, that becomes committed. Because we've already essentially spent that money and we're obligated to finish that out. Our restricted is also done by, that one has, that comes down through Tabor. And then our non-spendable is just the classification that comes through by looking at it by saying it's our inventories, it's, prepaids, because you can't necessarily spend a prepaid.
Do they have the CAFR?
Yes.
One thing that, and I don't mean
No,
to jump
you're
in
good.
here, but if you could turn to page 35 of our CAFR, that is regular English 35 as opposed to Roman numeral 35. That is the general fund budget comparison schedule where I think these numbers are coming from. And this might give you a slightly better picture of what is going on. It indicates under the actual column that we did spend $1.8 million more in expenditures than in revenues. And this is on a sources and uses basis. So all the monies that came into the city during the year or immediately after, compared to all the money that went out for expenditures or during the year or immediately after. And as Tammy has said, of that $1.8 million in expenditures in excess of revenues, roughly $3 million was from capital outlays. But if you look down to the bottom portion of this page, you can also see that there are financing proceeds that came in, which was proceeds from debt, generally for the purpose of financing capital outlays, as well as another $775,000 of proceeds from sale of other capital assets or older capital assets. So $1 million, a little over $1 million of that $1.8 million deficit came from other sources and not from fund balance. And then there was a roughly $1 million net transfer in from the proprietary business type activities funds. So when you look at the bottom half of this schedule, of this budgetary comparison schedule, I think it shows a little clearer picture that we're just not using up all of our fund balance to put us in peril in future years, but there are other sources of proceeds that have come in that are not classified as revenues under the accounting standards, but of other sources or uses of revenues and sources of money, if you will. Does that help a little bit?
Not really. That's still, well, it seems at times to be, with all due respect, a shell game. But let's move forward.
This slide is just showing the attendance that the Royal Gorge Bridge has had from 2010 to 2019. As you can see, in 2019, we did have a slight decrease in attendance from 2018.
And a decrease in revenue.
And a decrease in revenue. From our budget, we had budgeted, we came in slightly under what we had budgeted, at least in general fund. So then their revenues, and along with the attendance, you can actually see that their revenues were up slightly from 2018, even though the attendance was less. We're attributing some of that to the additional facilities that they have there, like the Via Ferrata, even though that came on late in the year, and the rides, the Sky Coaster, and those type of things. And we do receive that tracking from the bridge on a monthly basis to see what the utilization is.
We don't receive a cut we just receive a cut of the gate and the concessions?
There's a cut of the attraction fees.
Is there a cut of attractions too?
Yeah, that's because we helped pay for the Via Ferrata, so we
Right.
help get refunds or
Right.
revenue from it.
So, yeah, they report that to us every month. They tell us how many people use the Sky Coaster, how many use the Via Ferrata, and then they show how much revenue is generated from concessions and attendance. And then that's how we are being able to track where we're thinking we're going to be this year from what was budgeted and what they had initially projected their revenues to be as well. Next, we have our street improvement fund. The primary source of revenue there is the sales tax. That is the main source. We do receive interest as well. And of course, with our street improvement fund, it is 98% capital outlay, and the other percentage does go to interest that we do have to pay on our loan. And yes.
Where's the interest income coming from for the 2A?
For the 2A, it's based on the reserves that we have, and so each
okay.
fund, yeah, so it's allocated based on the balances. This is also a similar graph or table that we had prepared for water fund, similar to what we had done for general fund, where we're showing our total revenues and total expenditures. And as you can see, we did come in less in our normal revenues. Our charges for service were $368,000 less. Last year, we did track less in our usage, so our revenues were down in there. We did have a larger increase in tap fees last year. This is just showing our debt at the end of the year. You can see that between 2018 and 2019, we did have an increase in our debt. That is primarily from the issuance of our COPs that we closed on in March of 19 for stormwater. And then we also did issue leases for general fund for a couple pieces of equipment for streets. One item that we spoke to council about last year when we were preparing our 2020 budget was looking at our self-insurance fund and the reserves. And as you can see here, we had been, our reserves had went up in 17, 18 they came down, in 19 they came down. And that's when we were looking at it saying, this is not going to be sustainable, and we needed to do something different. And that's when we put the increase in the premiums for 2020 and made a few other modifications to our benefit plan that we offer to the employees. But we changed some of co-pays and those type of things to help offset that. And just so council knows, that has been a positive change, and we're anticipating not using as much reserves in 2020 from the self-insurance fund that we had thought. And so that's a good thing, and we're looking to actually have it come back into the range where we need to have it. We want to keep it between 800,000 and $1 million. Just to make sure that it is sustainable. And that is all I have.
I will turn the time over to Chris and Jim then.
Thank you very much.
And also, if you wouldn't mind, if you taking off your mask, just because now you're being broadcast.
Sure.
And I hate to ask this too, but also social distanced.
Oh, all right. I'll just
We
pass the
are
microphone
being
to you.
watched and criticized if we are not adhering strictly to the guidelines.
I assume these are picking up microphones.
Yeah, is your
Should
lights
be.
on? Yeah.
We started the audit in our performance of the review and updating of the internal control procedures within the city's cash disbursements and payroll cycles, as well as a review of the revenue cycle. We do that to determine if there are good policies and procedures in place that provide segregation duties and control features that allow the accounting records to be reported correctly. We then select a sample of transactions, and we test the control features within those internal accounting controls to determine whether they are operating as described and whether they are operating effectively based upon the actual transactions. Those would be things like, are the invoices approved before payment is made? Is the account coding for the general ledger reviewed and coded to the right account? Things of that nature. We do that for really two reasons. The first is that we are looking to determine whether the city has any significant deficiencies.
Oh, thank you. Or
or material weaknesses in internal controls. A significant deficiency is defined as a design flaw in the system of internal controls that would allow an error to go undetected in the ordinary course of business, and a material weakness is a significant deficiency that would result in a material misstatement to the financial statements. And based upon our analysis of the internal control structure, as well as our testing of the control features, we did not identify any significant deficiencies or material weaknesses in internal controls. That's where you want to be. The second reason we do all that work is to determine our control risk from an audit perspective inside of the city's internal control structure, and we use that then to determine what level and extent of audit work we do on the financial statements of the city at year end. And primarily what we do is utilize substantive testing, which is test of details, as well as analytic review. Test of details is where we drill down into account balances and we look at supporting documentation such as subsequent receipts, tying revenues to official documents, examining invoices that support expenditures, and looking at that supporting documentation. Analytic review procedures are then employed to look at revenues and expenditures as they compare to budget numbers, as they compare to previous years, as well as relationships between balance sheet accounts like receivables and payables to revenues and expenditures, looking for relationships that we either do not expect or cannot explain. And if we find those, then we do more test of details on the account balances that relate to those analytic review procedures. All of that work is done for the goal of the audit report, and in this case, your audit report is an unmodified report, which in layman's term is a clean opinion. Basically states that the financial statements are in accordance with general accepted accounting principles and applied on a consistent basis. With respect to the financial statements, I'm not going to get into the detailed numbers, but I do want to highlight two items that are changes from the previous year. The first is we have added a footnote disclosure at the tail end of all of the footnotes that is titled Subsequent Event. Basically informs the user of the financial statement that subsequent to year end, i.e. in 2020, the government of the United States as well as the state of Colorado declared an emergency, and that's the pandemic, and as a result, the city's going to have an impact on their financial statements, but the city has not determined the full impact of that on the financial statements. So it is just a warning to a user of the financial statements that something happened after year end that will have an impact, yet that impact has not been determined. And we have put those in all of our municipality audit reports and financial statements at 12/31/19 because that was a subsequent event that has impacted virtually everyone. The second thing is, that's a little bit of a different change from the previous year, is the city participates into two different defined benefit plans with the FPPA, the statewide hybrid plan and the defined benefit plan. And these are actuarial calculations where the actuaries of the fund itself, which is not the city's, they determine the present value of the future expected benefit payments, and they compare that to the present value of the future expected contributions and investment income, and it comes down to a net funded or unfunded position. And then each participant, from a municipality standpoint, reports its proportionate share of that unfunded liability or overfunded asset. And in the prior year, both of those were slightly overfunded, and therefore we reflected a small asset on the balance sheet. This year, one of those funds, the defined benefit plan switched to an unfunded position, and so that is a liability. So we have reported, or the city has reported, its proportionate share of that liability as a liability, and the city's proportionate share of the other funds overfunded is showing up as an asset. So we basically split those apart and shown one as an asset, one as a liability. And the reason we have to split them apart is legally there's no right of offset, so on the financial statements those two numbers cannot be combined. And this is not a new concept in the last couple of years, but it is in the last 10 years or so. Up to about 10 years ago, GASB, the Governmental Accounting Standards Board, rules for accountants were that we basically just deducted as an expense our contribution each year. But as some of these larger cities around the country, such as Detroit, Chicago, Atlanta, some of the larger cities in California, were experiencing rather large unfunded liabilities, GASB changed their position and said that each participant in a trust fund, a defined benefit trust fund that is with multiple entities, has to report their proportionate share of any unfunded liability or overfunded asset. And that proportionate share is calculated based upon the contributions that each participant makes compared to all the contributions. So, for example, if Canyon City went out and hired up and had more individuals participate in the plan from the previous year, their proportionate share would go up and that liability or asset would go up. The difficult thing for most lay people to grasp, and accountants to some degree, is that this liability will never be paid by the city. It's not like accounts payable where we have invoices that we have to pay with cash. It is simply our proportionate share of this unfunded liability that many different municipalities contribute into. The whole reason behind this change was to bring forward into more of the public domain the unfunded situations. And the benefit from that is people have been talking about it, and changes have been made, and the unfunded situations in many of the trust funds, especially in the state of Colorado, the teacher trust funds have improved their negative unfunded position. It's gained a lot more attention that way. But it does put numbers on your financial statement that aren't direct assets or liability of the city that they're going to get something from or pay something against. Your contributions are still going to be the same contributions year in and year out. Most of the changes on these proportionate share liabilities or assets are due from assumption changes, the assumed rate of investment return that the trust fund has, the assumed rate of cost of living increases, of retirement benefits paid, the life expectancy of the retirees, and all of those components that go into that actuarial calculation. But I do want to highlight that we did break those two out because one's an asset and the other one is a liability, because one's overfunded and this year one is underfunded. So hopefully that helps make something that's a little bit tough to grasp, even for a lot of accountants, a little clearer. Chris?
Thank you, Jim. We did issue a letter. It's called the Required Communications Letter. Everybody should have a copy of it. It's a pretty standard format letter. It's required by our accounting profession. The professional standards require that if we encounter certain conditions, we address those in the letter, and if we don't encounter those situations, we're to address that in the letter as well. Everyone should have a copy of this Required Communications Letter, I hope.
Is that,
Well, I'll summarize it for you. We did consider internal controls, as Jim mentioned. We looked at things like we performed risk assessments, conducted interviews, performed substantive tests. That's where we perform calculations, confirm bank balances, and perform analytical procedures. Yes, sir.
what's the title on that particular report that you're talking about?
Required communications letter?
I don't know.
It would have been emailed and been included in the packet. It is not part of the. It was in the blue binder I gave you on Monday.
It's in this thing? Oh, in this thing?
Yes, sir.
And where at in that
Is
binder?
it behind the CAFR, or?
I didn't put those together, I'm not sure.
It is a 3-page letter on our letterhead.
Well, I got
Yes.
something on your letterhead, but
No,
it's,
Yes, that's. I can't see it.
Yeah, that was good.
It was a
No,
separate.
no, that's
Part
right.
of the CAFR.
Did she not put it in?
Not part of the.
So they don't have the required.
That's all right, we can describe,
I can summarize.
we can summarize what's in it, and there's no negative things in it, to get to the bottom line real
that's
quick.
what I was looking for. Okay, this one? No,
No, that is our auditor's opinion on the financial statements.
Well, if I could continue, it has six bullet points in the letter, and if I may address the council, I'll cover those bullet points.
Sure.
There's nothing derogative or negative and that's what I'm about to convey. We did consider the internal controls that Jim mentioned, I just highlighted them. It discusses required supplementary information. You see a lot of that in the report, like the statistical section. We don't audit those, but we do review them. There's a comment in the letter that we just perform analytical procedures on those, and I just wanted to mention that. As far as accounting policies, we found no transactions that lacked authoritative guidance or consensus. So that's a good thing. Every transaction had authoritative policy behind it. As far as accounting estimates go, we found those to be reasonable and consistent with GAAP. We did propose 2 small adjustments. They're relatively routine. One was to Tabor. The council mentioned Tabor earlier. We made a small adjustment to Tabor, and then we made a small adjustment to the certificate of participations were issued at premium, and we amortized that premium. So fairly routine and small accounting estimate adjustments. We had no disagreements with management. I can't think of a single one. If they consulted with outside accountants or counsel, we're not aware of that. So we had no difficulties with management as far as the audit goes, other than COVID. And I do want to tell you, the council, they were very courageous and tenacious at getting us information, especially during the height of COVID when nobody knew how it was going to go. So thanks to your team for getting that to us, especially Rebecca and Tammy. And then finally, we're not aware of any other consultations with other accountants, as I mentioned previously. Questions on those 6 points?
And that consultation with other accountants comes from what was referred to 10, 15 years ago as opinion shopping, where management may not like our opinions,
right.
and so they go look for other accountants until they find one that does agree with them. And if we're aware of that, we have to communicate that, and we weren't aware of any of that. I will say this was a very interesting year for the audit process. There are a number of municipalities that extended their due dates with the state auditor's office. They were handing those out left and right. There's a number of them that still haven't finished their financial statement of their audit process because they weren't able to convert to a virtual environment from the management standpoint quite as easy as others. Most of our audit work is electronic to begin with, so we were able to pivot fairly quickly. And management here at the city was able to do so as well. And so we were able to get through the audit process, even though it was a completely different environment than what we normally experience when we come out with a couple auditors and look at lots of paper. Now all of that had to go electronic and in the virtual world, but we were able to get through it quite well, and hats off to management for their ability, as well as the city for being in the position where they were able to make that pivot at a moment's notice, like we found ourselves in March. So excellent job to the management of the city. We've talked about a lot. A lot of it is very technical. Does anybody have any questions? We'll take as long as you'd like.
Council Meissner.
I have a question. I don't think it's directed at you. I think it's directed, I have a question on page 40 of this report. And it's the fourth bullet. Is that an accurate statement there, Mr. Ryan? I mean, isn't there a limitation on that transfer?
There is a limitation,
Isn't that the $5,000 question there?
when it, so there is a limitation on what we can change based on not having council approval. And that's done with, basically a memo to council summarizing what we've done. We do come back to council with a formal resolution for transfers greater than 5,000. And yes, we do need to
I mean, should,
update that because we did modify a resolution in either late 2018 or early 2019 that changed that. Because this is saying the one from 1980, 89. So we do need to make sure that we get that updated on our side.
but the new resolution only authorized expenditures below 5,000, didn't it?
I believe it was 5,000 for fund transfers.
Without prior council approval. I think that paragraph needs to be updated accordingly.
Is that individual items less than 5,000 or aggregate items less than 5,000?
Individual, any,
Okay, so
line-
it could accumulate to more than 5,000, but any individual item under 5,000.
right.
And what our practice has been is that when we're coming to council and we see that an item possibly is going to be over budget, when we've requested the approval to spend, we've tried to identify that in the memo to council ahead of time so that when we do our quarterly cleanup, then you'll see all of the.
That would be the proper way to do it.
That is what we've been trying to do in our memos, so.
That's the way it was intended to work anyways. You know, my congratulations to our accounting department. They had big shoes to fill, and they seem to, I hate to say seemed, but apparently they're filling them. And that's joyous, at least for me, to know that two things, our funds are in good hands, that they're being taken care of, and the ethics are there, and that's very critical that, you know, we don't, there doesn't seem to be any funny stuff going on that happens. Thank you, I appreciate it.
Yeah, I'm also, you know, it was kind of a strange feeling to come here today without having our Harry here, and I'm glad to see that you are following so well in his footsteps and that we still have good reports from our auditors. Thank you.
Same here, you know, everything was good, we appreciate everything, but guess what? We're looking forward to the next budget with everything that's going on now
Oh,
with
yeah.
the COVID. So everybody's job is going to be even tougher next go around, but appreciate everything that's been done, and thank you very much.
And I just want to repeat the same thing, and I think things are progressing and it's looking great. And Tammy, thank you. You've been doing a fantastic job, and you're great to us. You answer as many questions as we throw at you, and I appreciate that. You've done fantastic. Thank you.
I don't want to pile on, but for the first year post-Harry, having the pandemic with the everyone having to go virtual, that was truly a test of the mettle of the accounting department and the whole city's operation. So it was a tough year to stand on your own 2 feet in the environment that we had. So very much so, congratulations are in order.
Rebecca Nelson was very key in getting everything together for our officers.
Well, thank you. And thank you to Jim and Chris as well for being here today and for your report. And if there's no other discussion, I'll go ahead and adjourn our meeting for today. Thank you.
Thank you.